When Trump looks at India today, what unsettles him most is not just a headline about growth rates or stock market surges, but the deeper reality that India is no longer a background player in the global economy. For decades, the narrative was simple America sat at the center, dictating the rhythm of global trade, capital flows, and technological innovation, while countries like India were expected to follow, to catch up, to align. That picture has shifted. India's economy is expanding at a pace that forces Washington to acknowledge a new distribution of power. A country that once fought to escape poverty is now projecting itself as a hub of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-sustaining growth. That rise is not merely financial. It is psychological because it changes how nations perceive America's monopoly on prosperity. What truly disturbs Trump is the symbolism behind this shift. Economic power is not only about numbers, it is about narrative. America has long framed itself as the ultimate destination, the land where progress originates. But when you see India producing world-class engineers, launching spacecraft to the moon at a fraction of the cost, and becoming a central force in global supply chains, it undermines the myth of exclusive American exceptionalism. Suddenly, the story is no longer that success flows from the West outward. It is that success can emerge anywhere, and perhaps in places that once stood on the margins. For Trump, who thrives on the image of America's unchallenged dominance, this is an uncomfortable realization. There is also the matter of scale. India's middle class is not a small demographic. It is a market larger than the entire population of most Western nations. For American corporations, this is both an opportunity and a danger. They cannot ignore it, but they also cannot dominate it as easily as before. Indian companies are no longer content to be subcontractors for Western firms. They are building their own empires, competing in pharmaceuticals, technology, and finance. That independence represents a break from the old dependency model. And when a nation of over 1 billion people starts rewriting the rules of the game, it creates tremors in the global hierarchy. Trump understands that economics is not isolated from politics. Economic rise translates into strategic leverage, and strategic leverage reshapes global alliances. If India can create wealth, if it can fuel growth without leaning on Western institutions, then it can also demand respect on its own terms. That is what unsettles Washington, the fear that America will no longer be the unquestioned gatekeeper of global power. Trump senses that unlike the economic booms of smaller nations, India's rise is systemic. It is not a ripple, it is a tide. So when we ask why Trump is worried about India, the answer goes beyond trade imbalances or tariffs. It lies in the deeper recognition that a new center of gravity is forming in the global economy, and it is not in Washington. The fear is not of India alone, it is of the precedent India sets for the world. If India can rise, others can too. And in that possibility lies the unraveling of America's monopoly on destiny. The truth is simple. Trump is not just worried about India's numbers. He is worried about what those numbers mean for America's place in history. And that is why India's ascent is not just an economic event, it is a psychological revolution, one that forces the world to rethink who truly defines the future. If we look deeper into the second reason Trump worries about India, it comes down to energy. Energy is not just about fuel, it is about control. For more than half a century, America's influence on the world has been tied to its ability to shape oil markets, to pressure nations into alignment through sanctions, and to dictate the flow of resources that modern economies depend on. That power has given Washington not just wealth, but leverage, the ability to enforce its will without firing a shot. But India is slowly rewriting that script. By refusing to bend under pressure and by diversifying its energy sources, buying oil from Russia, strengthening ties with Middle Eastern producers, and investing in alternative energy, India is carving out an independent energy strategy, and in doing so, it is loosening America's grip on one of the last great tools of global dominance. Trump sees this clearly. He knows that energy is not simply an economic concern, it is a psychological one. The nation that controls energy controls the choices of others. But when India confidently defies Washington sanctions, continuing to buy discounted Russian oil even at the height of Western outrage, it signals something much bigger than a trade deal. It signals sovereignty. It tells the world that America's threats no longer carry the same weight, that nations can choose what serves their people rather than what pleases Washington. For Trump, who built much of his political identity around the idea of American strength, this erosion of control is troubling. And there is another layer to it. Energy is symbolic of security. When India proves it can secure its fuel, it proves it can secure its future. That sends a message to other nations watching closely, nations long accustomed to bowing under U.S. energy dominance. If India can say no, why not them? This is what unsettles Washington most, not just India's choices, but the contagious example of independence it provides. America has long relied on fear, the fear of losing access to resources, the fear of sanctions, the fear of isolation. But fear only works until one nation stands tall enough to break it. At the same time, India is not simply buying energy, it is investing in renewables, in solar, in nuclear. It is preparing for a future where oil itself loses its absolute power. That dual approach, securing today's energy while building tomorrow's, makes India less vulnerable to external pressure. And that resilience is what Trump cannot ignore. Because America's influence has always been strongest when others were dependent. The more independent India becomes, the weaker that influence grows. So when we ask why energy dynamics matter in this story, the answer is clear: they are the foundation of modern power. Whoever controls them dictates the pace of history. And what Trump sees in India is not simply a buyer in the oil market, it is a nation declaring that it will not be controlled. What unsettles Trump, just as much as India's economic rise or its independence in energy, is the way India refuses to bend under external pressure. This is not the behavior Washington is accustomed to. For decades, U.S. foreign policy has relied on the assumption that nations, when pushed hard enough, will eventually yield. Some may resist at first, but sanctions, threats, and diplomatic isolation usually bring them back in line. Yet India disrupts this pattern. Its leadership has shown again and again that it will act in the interest of its own people, not in accordance with American expectations. And that act of resistance carries a weight far beyond economics or strategy. It is a psychological declaration of sovereignty. Trump understands the mechanics of power. He knows that dominance is not just enforced through military might or financial leverage. It is sustained by compliance. The system depends on nations believing they have no choice but to submit, but India does not play by those rules. When pressed to stop purchasing Russian oil, it refused. When pressured on trade deals, it recalibrated without backing down. Even on global issues like climate agreements or defense procurement, India consistently charts its own path. This is not arrogance, it is independence. And the more visible this independence becomes, the more it undermines America's ability to dictate terms globally. The philosophical dimension here is profound. Compliance, once broken, cannot easily be restored. When a nation proves that it can withstand external pressure without collapse, it changes the psychology of power, not only for itself but for others watching closely. That is the contagion effect of sovereignty. It spreads. And what makes Trump uneasy is not merely that India resists, but that India's resistance sets an example for nations that have long felt they had no option but obedience. In that sense, India becomes a symbol, a mirror reflecting back the weakness of coercive power when confronted by courage. This also complicates America's narrative of partnership. Washington often frames its influence as benevolent, as though its demands were aligned with global order. But when India openly resists and thrives nonetheless, it exposes the reality that many U.S. demands are not about global order at all, they are about control. Trump knows that once this perception takes hold, it erodes America's moral leverage. You cannot claim to be a champion of freedom while punishing nations for exercising their own. So this independence, this refusal to bow, is not simply a diplomatic inconvenience. It is a direct challenge to the very foundation of American influence. And that is why Trump worries. Because power is not lost in sudden collapses, it is lost in steady acts of defiance that normalize a new reality. Another reason Trump is uneasy about India lies in its growing military and strategic power. For a long time, India's role in global security was seen as secondary, a supportive force rather than a central player. But that perception is changing rapidly. India has been expanding its defense capabilities, modernizing its armed forces, and strengthening alliances across the Indo-Pacific. This is not happening in isolation. It is part of a deliberate strategy to ensure that India is not merely reacting to global security challenges, but shaping them. And this is precisely what unsettles Washington, because in every era America's dominance has rested on its ability to project military influence without competition. Yet now, India is becoming a pole of power in its own right. Trump knows that military strength is not just about weapons or armies, it is about psychological presence. The mere knowledge that a nation can defend its interests changes how others deal with it. India is no longer content to play the role of a silent partner in global conflicts. It is asserting its voice, its boundaries, and its willingness to act. The rise of India as a military power complicates U.S. calculations in the region. Washington wants India strong enough to counterbalance China, but not so strong that it can act independently of American influence. And that is exactly the tension Trump struggles with. India is proving it can do both. The Indo-Pacific is the clearest example. For decades, the U.S. dominated this region, positioning itself as the guarantor of stability. But with India stepping forward, building naval power, forging defense agreements, participating in strategic dialogues, there is no longer one unquestioned authority. Instead of being dependent on America's protection, India is creating its own sphere of influence. That means fewer nations will automatically look to Washington for direction. And that shift, while subtle, chips away at the monopoly of U.S. strategic dominance. There is also a deeper truth here: military independence signals civilizational confidence. A nation that builds its own defense, that refuses to outsource its security, is a nation declaring it will not be dictated to. This is about dignity as much as it is about defense. India's investments in indigenous weapons systems, space defense, and cybersecurity are not just practical, they are symbolic. They declare to the world that India does not need permission to protect itself. For a leader like Trump, who measures power in terms of leverage, that symbolism is powerful and threatening. What worries Washington is not that India is growing militarily, it is that India is doing so without becoming a subordinate partner. That independence transforms alliances into negotiations, not dependencies. And once a nation proves it can defend itself, it is no longer a client state. It is a peer. One of the most overlooked yet most significant reasons Trump is worried about India is its technological and digital revolution. For decades, America has been the unquestioned leader in innovation, whether in Silicon Valley, aerospace, or defense technology. That dominance gave Washington not just economic advantages, but cultural authority, the power to define what progress looks like. But today, India is rapidly dismantling that monopoly. In fields ranging from artificial intelligence to space exploration, from digital infrastructure to biotechnology, India is no longer a follower. It is a creator, and that changes the psychology of global power in profound ways. Trump knows that technology is not just a tool, it is the language of the future. Whoever builds the next generation of digital systems, space programs, or cyber capabilities will not simply dominate markets, they will dominate imagination. And India is showing the world that advanced innovation can emerge outside the West, outside the narrative that America alone invents while others imitate. Consider the symbolic weight of India's space missions. When India landed a rover on the moon at a fraction of the cost of NASA's projects, it was not just a scientific achievement, it was a message. It proved that excellence is not the property of the wealthy, that innovation does not belong exclusively to one corner of the world. For Trump, who is deeply invested in the image of American supremacy, that is a direct challenge. What amplifies this challenge is India's scale. With a massive population of engineers, entrepreneurs, and digital natives, India is not producing innovation for itself alone. It is shaping global markets. Its digital payment systems, its IT services, its pharmaceutical breakthroughs, they ripple far beyond its borders. This is where the anxiety grows in Washington, because if India can export not only goods but ideas, then American culture and technology no longer stand as the default standard. That erosion of cultural dominance is far more unsettling than trade deficits or market competition. And there is another layer to this. Technology builds soft power. When people across the world rely on Indian systems, Indian apps, or Indian innovations, they are not just consumers, they are participants in India's vision of progress. That subtle influence spreads quietly but deeply, reducing America's ability to control narratives. Trump understands that once nations start looking to India for technological solutions, they will also start listening to India's voice on larger global questions. This is not about rivalry in one sector, it is about the redistribution of influence. And it carries a philosophical weight. For centuries, power has been tied to who owns the future. America held that claim through its inventions, its industries, its cultural exports. But India's rise signals that the future will no longer be owned by one nation. It will be contested, shared, and redefined. That is what worries Trump most. Not that India is catching up, but that it is reshaping the very idea of who gets to lead. Perhaps the deepest reason Trump worries about India is not just its economy, its energy independence, its military strength, or even its technological rise. What troubles him most is the story India is telling the world, the rise of an alternative global narrative. For too long, the international system has been organized around a Western script, one that insists prosperity, progress, and legitimacy must be defined through the lens of Washington or its allies. But India refuses to read from that script. It is offering a different vision, one rooted in civilizational pride, in multipolarity, in the idea that no single nation should dictate the destiny of all. And that narrative is powerful because it does not just serve India, it resonates with every country that has ever felt overshadowed or spoken down to. Trump understands the stakes. He knows that power is not only enforced through armies or currencies, it is sustained by stories. Nations believe in narratives. They shape how leaders act, How people imagine their place in the world. America's greatest strength has always been its ability to project itself as the center of progress, the model everyone else must follow. But when India steps forward with confidence, asserting that it will define its path on its own terms, it cracks that illusion. And illusions, once broken, are rarely repaired. This is where the philosophical depth of India's rise becomes clear. By standing tall on its cultural and civilizational identity, India is showing that modernity does not have to mean westernization. Progress does not require surrendering tradition. Power does not require imitation. That message carries weight because it challenges the psychological dominance that has underpinned U.S. influence for decades. Trump sees that if India succeeds in building prosperity while holding firmly to its own worldview, it will inspire others to do the same. And once that happens, America's narrative of being the indispensable nation begins to dissolve. The danger from Washington's perspective is not that India resists America, it is that others may follow India's lead. When nations recognize they can chart independent courses, when they realize they do not need to accept Western definitions of legitimacy, the global order itself shifts. This is why Trump worries. Because what India symbolizes is bigger than trade, bigger than defense, bigger even than geopolitics. It symbolizes freedom from dependence. It represents the courage to say, we will define ourselves, and that is the most threatening idea of all, because control is lost not when one rival grows strong, but when the story that sustains control no longer commands belief. India is giving the world permission to believe something different, that greatness does not need approval, that sovereignty is its own justification. And here is the truth to carry with you: once a nation proves it can write its own story, it inspires others to pick up the pen, and that is how empires fade, not with a single battle, but with the quiet awakening of those who no longer accept someone else's script.